everything else along that value chain, we determined, and this wasn't just top management determining, this was at the line function level, because we felt it was very important to get the buy-in at that level, was either going to be customized or standardized, and that could be outsourced. So all those things, a lot of things that previously weren't on the table became on the table. And so that allowed us to really start to tell the story to the organization and for us to think about how we wanted to proceed, where what we were talking about was growing and redistributing work in a smart way. This wasn't about downsizing, this was about growth, but growth modulation. And just to give you a little bit of sense of what we're talking about in terms of the differences in the previous model that we had, if we just took the model for how we did our work prior to this re-engineering effort and layered on the pipeline, that would have resulted in about a 300% growth in the amount of internal people that were required. By changing the way we thought about the work internally versus externally, we could reduce that significantly, over by half the amount of growth necessary. And also, the proportion of the work that we'd be doing internally, more of it would be in the innovative space and less in the standardized or customized space. So the type of work that we would be doing internally would change. So this was really the backdrop for the beginning of the strategy for the sourcing. It's deciding what. What is it we want to be internally? What is it we want to do on the outside? The other thing that was going on in parallel around this time, we'd had quite a nascent effort for some time, but we definitely had an effort related to standards. And it became very clear that this work that we'd been doing in standards for many years dovetailed very nicely into thinking about how we could do sourcing better. So how can we drive scalability, by the mantra, build once, use many approach? We didn't have that. Everybody was kind of doing things differently, and it was not very efficient. We believed that if we really focused more on standards and standards implementation, that we could have more streamlined sourcing. And if we were going to be doing more sourcing, external sourcing, that was going to be very important. And so we spent a lot of time with this foundation and vision and building off that and dovetailing that all into our overall sourcing strategy. And around that time, we formed a new group that hadn't existed at the company before. It was called Study Standards and Implementation. We took individuals that used to do study builds, the ECRFs and the database builds, and the SAS programmers, and put them all together so that it was a single group that was thinking about the data, not just how we're going to get it, but how is it going to be reported out. And the concept really is shown here, which is to be able to provide a much more efficient model by which, just based on what's written in a protocol, we could have ECRFs and database programs and SAS programs all linked together, and in a way that then we could more efficiently outsource that. We'd be able to tell our outsourced partners, this is how we do our work, this is the parameters, in a very scalable and reproducible way. So that was kind of the what, the how of the outsourcing was the next question. Do we want to do compound partnering? And for the purposes of this discussion, that really wasn't a major part of the strategic, the initiative on the sourcing. But it was really, should we work with full service CRO providers or functional service providers or both? And I'd say prior to this exercise, we were a company that kind of did things somewhat piecemeal, a lot of FSPs, a lot of different FSPs, a large list of different providers we worked with. And we had lots of debate, as you could imagine, around this subject. The individual line functions very much wanted to remain with the pure FSP model. I think as we thought a lot about the scale and what was going to be most efficient for the future, I think we felt that the fewer the number of handoffs, the better, and really moved us more to a full-service CRO model. And so this is the model that we developed, which we would work with large full-service provider model for program execution. That would give us the global and therapeutic expertise, the resources available for rapid program expansion, and this integrated outsourcing would be more efficient. The fewer the handoffs, the better. However, there are certain areas where we continue to use more of an FSP model in pharmacovigilance. We had a long-standing relationship already. We kept that one. Regulatory strategy, medical writing. I would say there's also work around some of the very customized or innovative biomarker work or imaging or some of the e-pro work, that we would continue to work with FSPs in a very specialized manner. But by and large, all the rest of the work we would outsource to full service CROs. And of course, there would be some flexibility on a case-by-case basis, but really trying to adhere to the model. And now I just wanted to put up the sourcing vision, because as much as I told you that we had sort of a blank slate and this wasn't going to be as hard as maybe one could imagine, in fact, there was a big cultural change that was required at the company. And one of the very first things that we did once we figured out this is what we wanted to do was we developed a sourcing vision, and something that we could communicate to our employees and make sure that we keep coming back to it at every opportunity to say, this is what we are doing, this is what our vision is. And so I want to highlight a few things in this, which is, we aspire to be a top oncology development organization. We want to leverage a small core team internally at the company that's focused us on activities that enable a competitive advantage. So what are those things that we need to have that we believe is going to make us competitive? Everything else we're going to look to do on the outside. And the key sources of competitive advantage that we saw were in the setting the clinical strategy, developing the global relationships with our KOLs, with regulatory agencies, and also with our preferred providers. So that was very important to be able to have those strong relationships. Learning from the innovative work in clinical development and in translational medicine, and orchestrating the complex work streams involved with vendor management. So those are what we really want to be good at internally. And then everything else, as I said, we would outsource to a small number of select global CROs where we would develop very deep and long-lasting relationships. And then lastly was the standards piece, being able to come up with rigorous standards to make our work more efficient and be able to work with our sourcing partners on that. So what were the challenges? I've alluded to some of these to this new sourcing vision. First of all, a gap between the strategy and the ability to execute, a lot of questions about, maybe not complete buy-in, that we didn't really have standards yet, we don't have a sufficient investment in our relationships. There was a little bit of an adversarial mindset at times with some groups saying, I really don't trust the CROs can do the work, I'm not really willing to give it up. And that resulting in potential duplication and high transaction costs. And then, utilizing the new sourcing strategy based on traditional or existing sourcing methods. So people had the ways that they'd worked with partners in the past, and they were thinking, well, that's the way it is. Haven't been happy in the past, not being open to things. And then the last thing, which I'm going to touch on, is building MILLENIUM reputation as an ideal sponsor. So one of the things that we were trying to do is to build ourselves as a leading company in oncology. A lot of that is about relationships with sites. How does that fit in with a model where we're doing much more work on the outside, where many more of the touch points than with the investigative sites aren't with MILLENIUM, they're with our CROs? How do those two things come together where we can reconcile that? So we did a lot of work on change management. I would say probably, over the last year and a half, it's been constant change management. But I think it's absolutely critical. If I look back, it was absolutely critical and necessary, the amount of time and effort we put into this. Because if the organization, to its core, doesn't really believe in the model or isn't willing to change, you're never going to, no matter what the leadership says, it will never come to fruition. And this is just an example of some of the kinds of data that we got back. We were able to convince people that, yes, change is required. We showed them that pipeline and said, how are we ever going to do this if we keep our model the way it is? And I think people bought into that. But where there was questions like, I'm not sure that we really have all the capabilities and skills necessary to do the work on the outside. I'm not sure I have all that, and I'm not sure all the other people in the organization are bought in. So what was pretty clear is a lot of our efforts needed to be focused on how do we give the people the right skills and the training to allow them to do their job in a way that a different way to do their job. And then a lot of focus on this. So the multifaceted change management process that we went under, first of all, we created a clinical outsourcing group. We'd had one before. It had been part of the finance organization. That group now became part of the overall medical clinical organization. We had a communication strategy. We have a medical sourcing vision portal, so you can go on and read all about the activities, our approach, our processes, who we work with, all of that in a one-stop place. We've set into place governance committees. We, very importantly, revised job descriptions. And lastly, I really want to emphasize this training on new roles and outsourcing. How do you take somebody in a SAS programmer who used to do the programming himself or herself? How do we train them to oversee the work on the outside? What does that look like? And do it in a way where we're not duplicating work. We didn't want to be in a situation where we had one for one. We wanted to figure out a new way to work. So that was very critical. So I just want to touch a couple moments on this aspect of how do you become a sponsor of choice, which was a real goal of ours when we're doing more of our work where we're not touching the sites. You know, they're going to